Very few people have read Freud. Very few people today read the early Frankfurt School critical theorists who are developing this stuff. But a lot of people look at pornography. A lot of people look at soap operas and sitcoms. A lot of people look at things that preach this gospel of your life is about sexual fulfillment in the here and now. And sex is purely recreational. It comes with no cost. You can have hookup after hookup and walk away and feel no burden as a result thereof. Those ideas, you don't have to be reading critical theorists to be getting those ideas. You just have to be watching The Young and the Restless or Days of Our Lives or whatever it is. Even some of the commercials sort of preach that. So these ideas have really come down from the elite to being, as you put it, so the air that we breathe.
Hello, and welcome back to another episode of The Naked Gospel. I am your host, Shane O'Neill. Over the last few weeks, we've been able to interview people like Marcos Perez and Christy Outlaw, individuals who've been deeply impacted by the sexualized culture that we find ourselves in. When I hear their stories and I look at the expectations and standards of intimacy and love in the culture around me, I can't help but ask the question, how do we get here? And often the best way forward is to understand how you got to a certain location, even culturally and historically. So to that end, we asked Dr. Carl Trueman to join us. Dr. Carl Trueman is Cambridge and Aberdeen trained historian. He is an awesome guy, super easy to banter with, and really fun to interview. So I'm really looking forward to this. He has spent the last few years trying to answer the question, what is the sexual revolution and how did it happen? So to that end, he wrote a book on his findings, The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. It is a new release. I just finished reading it and I'd recommend it to anyone. If you are interested, there's a link to it down below. But for me, before I read this book, when I heard the phrase, the sexual revolution, I had no idea what it actually meant. I knew it has some crazy impact on the culture around me, the culture that we have today. But I didn't know if it was like an event. I associated it with like Woodstock. I didn't know if it was an ongoing phenomenon. I have no idea. I had no idea what the sexual revolution was. So this book has been incredibly helpful, and I think this conversation will be incredibly helpful to answer the question, what the heck is the sexual revolution? So let's go ahead and jump right into the conversation. All right. Dr. Trueman, thank you for being on again. This is round 2. And I am just as excited about it. You are an easy person to interview, so I'm looking forward to this time with you.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me on.
For sure. For those who might not know, would you mind just giving a bit of a bio of yourself?
Sure. My name's Carl Trueman. I now teach at Grove City College in Western Pennsylvania. I grew up in the West Country of England. I was educated at the universities of Cambridge and Aberdeen in the United Kingdom, taught at the universities of Nottingham and Aberdeen in the UK before coming to America in 2001 to teach at Westminster Theological Seminary in Philadelphia. From there, I went to Princeton University in 2017 as a James Madison Fellow, and in 2018 landed in Grove City College. Married to Katrina, 2 grown-up sons.
Very cool. That's quite the bio. I imagine you said 1 year at Princeton?
Yes.
I imagine that was a dream come true. That probably was a good time, wasn't it?
It was, in some ways, intellectually, in terms of intellectual culture, it was the high point of my career, having
That's cool.
Regular coffee with the other fellows. It just exposed me to a whole lot of new ideas, interesting people, really helped me in my work in many different ways.
And it sounds like you have kind of your dream job right now, where you get to kind of pick what you study and then engage that stuff with your students. So it seems like things are going well.
Sort of. It's not quite as straightforward as that, but by and large, I teach what I want now.
Yeah, that's cool.
I love teaching undergraduates. I think that age 18 to 22 is so critical. When kids leave home and they're starting to think for themselves, it's just a great time to engage their minds. Really enjoy undergraduate teaching.
I love all of that. Yeah, those are some of my most formative years, and some of the things that the teachers, some of them are still very close friends of mine, which I really appreciate. Teachers who don't just give knowledge, but also give relationship and stick around. So it sounds like you're that kind of professor, which makes me appreciate you that much more.
I enjoy my friendships to the students as well. And my wife, even the couple of years we've been here, my wife and I are still in touch with kids who've graduated from Grove that I taught, and it's great to see them growing and moving on with their lives.
Amen. Okay, I want to. So we're going to look at the sexual revolution. You just wrote a new book. Actually, would you take a minute and just tell us about this book that you've written? I've talked about it in the introduction, but hearing maybe your elevator pitch on it, and then we can go ahead and excavate some of that together.
Okay, it's called The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, Cultural Amnesia, Expressive Individualism, and the Road to Sexual Revolution. And it's really my attempt to explain the dramatic transformation in sexual mores, sexual habits, sexual standards that we're witnessing in the world today against the backdrop of much broader and deeper changes in Western culture over the last 350 years. So it's I suppose in some ways it's an ambitious attempt to do a kind of intellectual and cultural genealogy of the current political moment.
No, I love all of that. Would you mind tracing out for us initially what it is that you see that caused you to write this book? I say it that way. I remember reading Joshua Chatraw and Karen Swallow Prior's Cultural Engagement, and they likened a lot of culture as we live inside of it to kind of like an individual smell, or like a family smell. Like, you don't know you have a smell, and then you loan a shirt to a buddy, like, oh, it smells like you. And it's not a pejorative thing. They're not trying to be negative. But there's an odor about culture, and it's hard to actually appreciate what it is. But you've been around to see some of it shift. And so really just want to engage some of the things that you've seen that precipitated this kind of research.
Yeah, I mean, in picking up on that comment about, culture being the sort of the air that you breathe or the water that you swim in, I do think being an immigrant is helpful. When you come in to a culture as an outsider, you often spot things that people within that culture, natives to that culture, don't spot. So I guess American culture has always intrigued me since the moment I arrived in 2001. The specific question driving behind the book was the one about the plausibility of the sentence, I am a woman trapped in a man's body, which what interests me about that sentence is that 35 years ago, my grandfather would have regarded that as complete nonsense. And yet now it's not only regarded as plausible, but actually any claims that it isn't plausible are likely to render you subject to accusations of transphobia or being antisocial or bigoted in some way. So what I wanted to do in the book was get at how has that come about, that such a radical claim has now become so normalized, not simply for academics in fancy philosophy seminars at Ivy League universities, but for the ordinary man or woman in the street. Why is this the common currency of our culture? And probing that question really took me on a much deeper historical path than I'd originally anticipated, because my conclusion was, in actual fact, transgenderism is the product of several hundred years of a slow but steady redefining, reimagining of what it means to be a self, an individual human person.
No, that's really helpful, because the sexualized aspect of our culture is so ubiquitous that it's hard to imagine something else, or it's hard to imagine that it's even there in a sense. But like once you start breaking it apart, where there are hookup apps that like almost everyone uses for dating, the word dating is almost antiquated. It's like not really even used anymore. If a parent says like, oh, who are you dating? The kid's like, ew, like, as though they have some kind of visceral reaction to that word. Pornography is rampant, it's everywhere. Everyone's using it. So everything from like our dating to our relationships, and I think pornography is like responsible for something like 80% of divorce, so like it's in our wedding beds, it's in our children's lives. So it's everywhere. That's one of the reasons I wanted you to come on so badly, because to appreciate where we are, we also need to look at how we got here. And so I'm excited to get into that. Before we jump into self, because you used the word self, and that's a major point in your book, I want to look at the word sexual revolution, because even me, like I struggle to even understand like if it's an event or how to even qualify the phenomenon of the sexual revolution. Everyone talks about it like it's like associated with Woodstock, and some people think it's synonymous with Woodstock. And so how do you define, or how do you go about looking at the sexual revolution?
Well, I would define the sexual revolution as that massive transformation of sexual habits, customs, morality, however you want to think of it, that's taken place really since the 1960s. Now, the important thing about that is to say that in making that claim, I'm clearly aware that many, if not all, of the sexual practices which are now commonplace in our society, whether it's homosexuality, lesbianism, whatever, free love,
yes,
all of these things have precedence in history. You know, there's no era of history that doesn't have its broad range of sexual behaviors manifested in the culture. The difference with the sexual revolution is that those things have become mainstream and acceptable. You know, people have always committed adultery. Once upon a time, it was considered a heinous social crime. Now it barely raises an eyebrow. People have always engaged in homosexual activity. Once upon a time, it was considered transgressive. Now it's mainstream. Once upon a time, you know, people slept together before they got married, but it was considered transgressive. Now it's part of the mainstream culture. So when I'm talking about the sexual revolution, I'm not talking about simply the massive expansion of the way people behave sexually. What I'm talking about is the total overthrow of traditional sexual morality relative to the practices that have always gone on.
How... If you can, because you actually touched on it, which sparked some stimulation in my direction, is that how you go about maybe articulating the sexual ethic post-sexual revolution, where I guess more of like a secular humanistic approach, where if it's what I feel and I'm passionate about and it doesn't hurt somebody, then it's permissible and maybe even ethical. Is that?
Yes, I think the traditional Christian approach to sexual morality would be that certain acts have an intrinsic moral status about them, that simply performing those acts is wrong or is bad. I think what we've shifted to today is the notion that, as you pointed out, as long as I'm not harming somebody, we might say, as long as what's happening is taking place between consenting adults, and nobody's being damaged or harmed by it, then it's okay. In other words, the acts themselves cease to have any intrinsic, they are amoral in some ways. They cease to have any intrinsic moral value beyond that which is given to them by the context of consent or denied consent in which they take place.
No, that's super helpful. Okay. So jumping in then to the word self, it's almost a word that people kind of take for granted, or like self-identity, or either they take for granted, or there's this really big fascination right now with like psychometric systems, whether it's the Enneagram or Myers-Briggs or whatever it might be. And so there's, on the one end, a lot that's informing what the self is, and then on the other end, it's really taken for granted when it comes to like introspection and how we inhabit culture well. And so I'd be interested then how you look at self and what you mean by self.
Well, the way I'm using the term self in the book is it's not the common sense. I mean, there's a typical way in which all human beings have always been basically aware of selfhood. You know, if we'd lived 800 years ago, I'm pretty sure that I would have known I wasn't you, and you'd have known that you weren't me. There's that basic intuitive knowledge of our own self-consciousness, we might say, as being different from the self-consciousness of others around us. What I mean by self, particularly in the book, is what is it that makes me me? What is it that really constitutes me? What is it that makes me unique? What is it that makes me tick? Where does my identity lie? What do I consider to be the good life? What do I consider to be the purpose of my life? All of these things tie into this broader, richer understanding of self. And my contention in the book is that the way we understand that notion of selfhood has changed over the last 350 years in a way that perhaps didn't make the sexual revolution inevitable when we started down that path, but has certainly made the sexual revolution a coherent and logical outcome of what has gone on, if I can put it that way.
No, that's helpful. If I'm hearing you rightly, what you're saying is at the sexual revolution, it was maybe even the climactic moment where selfhood changed, or the way we understood selfhood changed, and you went back and traced some of those antecedents to find out why that happened. Because when selfhood changed, our sense of identity and maybe even what it means to be human started to shift. Yeah. Thus, our ethics, specifically our sexual ethics, how we use our bodies, have shifted so much. And that's then the focus of this book. Is that?
Yes. I mean, the book sees, in broad terms, I see three specific moves in the understanding of the modern self taking place. One, first of all, there's a psychologizing of the self, and that is my inner feelings become the most important thing about me. We really see that in a thinker like Rousseau in the 18th century, particularly in the Romantics in the early 19th century. The idea that it's my feelings are most important, and of course with that other things happen as well. So happiness becomes an inner feeling of psychological contentment. The next move is the sexualizing of psychology, and here the key figure, I think, is Sigmund Freud. Freud is the man who says, human beings, we're psychological beings, and foundational to our psychology is actually our sexual desire. In other words, sexual desire becomes something that is foundational to who we are. It becomes foundational to our identity. Think about the importance of that. Today we routinely think of, we'll talk about a gay person, or we'll talk about sexual orientation, we'll talk about sexual identity. That's a kind of an odd way to talk. The ancient Greeks, homosexual practice was a standard part of ancient Greek culture. But ancient Greeks didn't typically think of themselves fundamentally in terms of their sexual desires and practices. That's something we've learned culturally over time, I think, as a result of Rousseau and the Romantics being refracted then through the Freudian sexual lens. And then in the 20th century, we have the politicization of sex, when particularly certain influential figures on the New Left come to identify political oppression with sexual repression. And therefore the fight for political liberation becomes the fight for sexual liberation, the fight for the recognition, acknowledgement of the range of our sexual desires, the range of our sexual identities. Only when they are all recognized by society can we be truly free. So sex becomes highly politicized. And that, I think, it really sets up the heady brew that has created the rather fractious and indeed volatile political culture in which we find ourselves today.
No, that's extraordinarily helpful. I am curious to know what happened. I'm going to say his name wrongly, but even as I say it wrongly, it still makes me sound smarter. Jean-Jacques Rousseau. What you intentionally pick up there, and so it seems like something happened either with that man or during that era that brought a shift that was significant enough to start there. So would you mind maybe letting us peer into that just a little bit more, because I'd be interested on that point.
Yes, well, Rousseau is an interesting figure, an 18th century philosopher out of Geneva, a remarkable man. I mean, a genius. He's self-taught. He's a composer. He's a high-flying civil servant. He comes from a very humble background. He's a philosopher. He's a novelist. You name it, Rousseau kind of had his finger in it somewhere. I think he captures a certain cultural moment quite brilliantly in his thinking, in that the Reformation's happened, the authority of the church is shattered, The questions about, what does life mean? Where is certainty to be found? These are the things that are bubbling up in what we call the Enlightenment. And Rousseau is the man who realizes that reason, rational thought, isn't really enough to fully explain what it means to be a human being. That actually our sympathy, our empathy, our emotions, they're very important in what it means to be a human being. And I would agree with him on that. I mean, I think Rousseau has an admirably sophisticated understanding of what it means to be a human being. His real where he sort of gets controversial, however, is in his basic idea that it's actually society that screws you up. If we were left in a state of nature, we'd be okay. We wouldn't envy people. We wouldn't be jealous. There wouldn't be petty rivalries or ambitions. Everybody would just be perfectly attuned. And guess what? Everybody would be able to be outwardly that which they feel themselves to be inwardly. They would be able to be authentic. And when you think of how the notion of authenticity is so important in modern culture. Think of Bruce Jenner coming out as Caitlyn Jenner, and the kind of language he used in that interview with Diane Sawyer about, I was living a lie, now I'm free to be the real me. This is the language of authenticity. And this is language that really finds its roots in the social thinking, the social philosophy, the social psychology that Rousseau is developing in the 18th century. And Rousseau is really the man who is an inspiration to the Romantics, the great, particularly Percy Bysshe Shelley. And the Romantics are important because they take this importance of the inner life and of emotions, and they express it in an artistic form. And that's how to communicate elite ideas to others in society. Art, music, novels, these kind of things. That's the way these ideas make their way out into the population in general. So Rousseau and the Romantics, central figures in the development of the Western notion of selfhood.
Yeah, no, that's significant. That's because that's bumps almost right up against the Enlightenment in a lot of ways, and it seems like Romanticism is kind of a reaction to the arrogance of the Enlightenment, and then you have this ethic of what you feel is true, right? And so like that is our ethic today. Like that's what we use all the time, and so it's wild to think that like hundreds of years ago it started then, and we've just put a scaffolding around it since then to kind of reinforce and justify it.
Yeah, well. The real issue is, of course, the French Revolution. The French Revolution was meant to be the triumph of reason. It ends up as a bloodbath. And you have these European intellectuals wrestling with, okay, now that religion's gone, how do we make human beings decent? That's an English word, of course. Decency is an English concept. How do we make them civilized? How do we make it that they can get on with it, that they're good people? How do we do that? Well, the answer is we have to attune their sentiments correctly so they empathize with others. And Rousseau, this is where Rousseau's thinking gets picked up. You have Friedrich Schiller, the German playwright and poet, arguing that art is what does that. It's the production of art that most unifies human beings, that we're divided against ourselves. Our reason and our emotions are always in conflict, but art can bring them together in harmony and make us good people. What, of course, the Romantics had that we don't have is they had this great confidence that there was such a thing as human nature, that it had a moral structure, and that therefore that would give our empathy a natural shape. What we lack today, of course, we've got their aesthetics, or we've got all the stuff about feelings, but those feelings are now detached from any notion that there is any kind of morally authoritative or morally shaped human nature to regulate and stabilize those things. So we have anarchic chaos. If Oprah Winfrey thinks it's right in her heart, it must be right in her heart. If I look at that terminally ill person and it breaks my heart that they can't just take their own lives, then surely it's right for them to take their own lives. We have no broader moral framework rooted in a notion of human nature that allows us to control our ethics relative to the aesthetics of sentiment.
So you see Rousseau's work as, in a lot of ways, the initial seed that brings us all the way up to postmodernism. Would that be accurate to say?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a great man theorist of history, so I never want to say it's one person.
Sure,
but I would say in terms of the development of the way European intellectuals thought about these issues, Rousseau is one of the signally important figures. Obviously, his thinking needs to be picked up by the Romantics, that there are stages along the way to getting to where we are today. But I would say Rousseau is extremely important. If you've ever thought, well, you ever heard the argument, well, society screwed that person up, in which there's often a fair amount of truth in particular examples, but that's a Rousseau argument. Rousseau's the man who really first sort of makes that in a powerful way, that we are made good, and it is society and culture that makes us inauthentic.
No, that's helpful. That being coupled into those three areas of examination that you traced out for us earlier on, because when it comes to sexual identity, it's almost the entirety of how we conceive of being human. Like most of us don't value family. So like the idea of fatherhood or sonship or whatever, like those aren't like primary aspects of our identity. What really matters ends up being like sexual preference and sexual pleasure. And so it's really helpful to have that inception piece that brings us all the way up to today, because today it is, as you said, it is the water that we swim in. And it's helpful for me because it's hard for me to even acknowledge that apart from wrestling with the ideas that you're putting forward.
Yeah, and of course, in focusing on the sexual aspect of this, it's useful to remind ourselves, very few people have read Rousseau, very few people have read Freud, very few people today read the early Frankfurt School critical theorists who are developing this stuff, but a lot of people look at pornography. A lot of people look at soap operas and sitcoms. A lot of people look at things that preach this gospel of your life is about sexual fulfillment in the here and now. And sex is purely recreational. It comes with no cost. You can have hookup after hookup and walk away and feel no burden as a result thereof. Those ideas, you don't have to be reading critical theorists to be getting those ideas. You just have to be watching The Young and the Restless or Days of Our Lives or whatever it is. Even some of the commercials sort of preach that. So these ideas have really come down from the elite to being, as you put it, so the air that we breathe, the smell of the shirt that we wear.
Yeah, no, that's helpful because it's not just in the Ivy Leagues. Like these are, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body is a statement that families are wrestling through, right? Like those are conversations that neighbors are having, and so from top to bottom, like and everything in between, it is it's pervasive. It's something that's it's very pertinent. It's very emotionally charged right now when it comes to people's dissonance, but also relationships. Yeah,
and it permeates Christianity, or at least Christianity by the name. The recent Ligonier research into what evangelicals believe. Well, first of all, 30% of evangelicals don't believe Jesus is God, which raises immediate questions about how you're using the word evangelical. That sounds like a sociological term at that point to me. But 20% think gender is a matter of personal choice. 20% of those who would in some way identify with the visible church think that gender is a matter of personal choice. That shows how deeply these ideas have come to use Charles Taylor's term, have come to inhabit the social imaginary. These people aren't believing these things because they've grasped Nietzsche and they've grasped the anti-metaphysics that you need to hold to behind. It's just the way they intuitively think about the world. Because hey, if Dave thinks he's really Davina trapped in a man's body, who am I to argue? I don't want to upset Dave. I don't want to oppress him or make him feel marginalized. It's my job to affirm him in his inner feelings, as long as nobody else is getting hurt.
Yeah. No, that's really good. So when it comes to okay. So look, you've looked so much. I loved this book, and I came across your work initially like years ago when I think I was reading an article by Andrew Wilson, and he'd come across your articles. No, it was you had uploaded I think all of your medieval and Reformation series lectures, like onto Apple Podcasts or something. And I've been through them like twice now, and I absolutely love them.
My past life as a church historian.
Yes. Yeah, which I thought was cool, because I came across this book and I was like, I thought he was, a church historian. All of a sudden he's talking about the sexual revolution. So just really, really cool to see you jump into this, because this is a massive, it strikes me as a massive project. Like I've done like a grad thesis before. It was over 100 pages, but nothing like the work you're putting together. And so even the methodology in the beginning, which is what Andrew Wilson says, well, he said that's what he appreciated about you most, that you give context and then you start looking at key players. This is supposed to looking at key players and then framing the context from there. And I see that in the book, because you use Alistair McIntyre, Charles Taylor, and Philip Reef.
Philip Reef, yeah.
Yeah, so use them as kind of use their ideas to help you engineer the historical evaluation.
They give me a sort of lens or some useful concepts to look through and try to organize the material. Yes,
it's so helpful, so helpful. So if somebody gets the book just for that alone, I would highly recommend it, because the way you help us to engage those guys' thoughts, that we can look at history rightly through a cultural lens and not just like an elitist ideological lens. So very helpful. So I think all of this brings us towards the end of our conversation, where what is the self, because you've got Descartes, I think therefore I am, you've got and then you've got somebody like James K. Smith, like you are what you love, which is a more Augustinian in his approach, where our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you, as Augustine says. So how do you understand self? And I know that you are you love the church, and so how does the church engage this stuff, and what do we do with it?
Yeah, well, it's tough, because one of the things that I became very aware of as I was writing the book is how much of our understanding of ourselves, we tend to think of ourselves as a monologue. I am, my desires, I am, but actually those desires are the result of a dialogue. I use an example with the kids in class. I'll say, if I took your iPhone from you and said, it's okay, I'll give you back in 6 months' time, how would you feel? Well, they'd feel pretty ticked. That's the usual reaction. They wouldn't feel themselves. Their identity is very much wrapped up with the networks that they're able to get to through their iPhones. Well, that wouldn't have been the case even 30 years ago. For me, growing up, never heard of an iPhone. No such thing existed. I didn't have those desires. I had desire, but it was shaped in different ways. My personhood was shaped in different ways. So one of the things I became acutely aware of in writing the book is the dialogical nature of selfhood. And so, for example, the surge in transgender teens we've seen over the last couple of years, is that the result of the fact that for thousands of years there have been all these teenagers who are really transgender but terrified to say anything about it because society wouldn't accept them? Or is it actually the result of the fact that society has made this a way of belonging, a way of being somebody, a way of being special, a way of being yourself? Well, it's the latter. The real question for the problem for the church then is, if the self is the result of a dialogue with a community, the strongest community is going to win. The strongest community will shape the self. And that leads me to think that the church, we can't simply address this problem through correct doctrine. I'm an Orthodox Presbyterian man. Good doctrine is very important to me, but it's not in itself sufficient. There has to be a community aspect, because doctrine is received and shapes people within a community. And that's what I like. I think James Smith is absolutely correct when he kind of points to the Enlightenment and says, epistemology, it only gets you so far, but the most important things in life are things that epistemology doesn't deal with. The things that you love, or on the flip side, the things that you hate. There's that, dare I say it, there's that kind of romantic dimension. It is what you feel to some extent. It is your sentiments to some extent. And what the church has to do is work hard at at shaping and cultivating those things, that our desire for the church and our desire for Christ and our desire to find our identity there is much stronger than our desire to find it anywhere else. And it will only be that strong through strong community. I think when to convert to Christianity from the LGBTQ community, I would imagine is as hard to convert from Islam or Judaism, because you're not simply changing one set of ideas for another. You're exchanging one community for another. And that's very hard to do. I was converted in England at a time where I could be a Christian and still be part of the community that I belonged to when I wasn't a Christian. It was that kind of world. It was an easy move for me. If we're going to address the LGBTQ moment, if we're going to address how it's gripping the imaginations of young people, even within the church's own ranks, if we're going to do that in a compassionate way, but an effective way, it's not enough to say that's wrong. We have to actually embody in our churches and in our communities something that is obviously better and obviously stronger.
I know a major impetus for this work was Rod Dreher. He wrote your foreword for the book.
He did.
And his call for community, and even like community as family, which seems to be how Paul conceives of it, the Apostle Paul conceives of it as well, is it seems like you guys are at least similar in the sense that the call for the orthopraxy, if you will, the actual living out and the knowing truth together in real life. Because as you say, somebody leaving a community like that, which can actually be quite close knit when it comes to the LGBTQ community, coming to something like that where it's like, well, I go to a place once a week, worship God with people I don't know, and then I promise to see them next week, and that's supposed to save the world, or like give me like a sense of being known. And so it sounds like your challenge is for the church, but then the church leadership, but also the church body, where it's like, no, guys, like we can actually know this community thing together. Is that fair to say?
I think so. I think for a long time in the United States, the broad Christian mind was gripped by the idea that getting the right Supreme Court nominees, getting the right president, getting the right laws on the statute books was going to be enough to do it. That's part of our culture, but it's not the whole culture. I remember when Obergefell versus Hodges went down, first things had asked me to do 2 pieces in advance so they could publish one of them straight away. One when the verdict went in favor of gay marriage, one when it went against. So I wrote my 2 pieces, I sent it in, and the editor got back to me and he said, I've got your 2 pieces here, but I noticed there's only 1 sentence difference between the 2 of them. And I said, because I actually, I think the verdict may have some implications each way for religious freedom, but by and large, the culture's already spoken, the culture's already moved. How do you change the culture? Well, not by taking over Congress for Jesus anytime soon or ever, I don't think, in the United States. The way you're going to change the culture is by changing your local community. I can't have any impact on, or I can have very limited impact, it seems to me, on Congress. I can't even in Pennsylvania have much impact on Harrisburg, where the state capital is. But I can have an influence on the kids in my class. I can have an influence on my neighbors. I can have an influence on the people who sit next to me on the pew on a Sunday. I can give them hospitality. I can be friendly. I can care for them. I can carry their burdens for them. I can make a difference there. And I think Christianity, I'm absolutely with Rod on this. There needs to be a reorientation for numerous reasons, but as much as anything, a reorientation to the local, because the local's actually where you do have real influence.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people hear the word missions and it intimidates them, like they're the superstar Christians. And when you even say like, no, like have somebody over to your house and just spend time with them, like that's a missiology that like anybody can practice, like absolutely anybody. When it just comes to like hospitality, where it's like just love well and love by being like honest, and like honesty isn't void of compassion, like break with people, hurt with people, grieve with those who grieve, and rejoice with those who rejoice. So I love your call. Yeah, I love it. Okay. You've been a rock star This is second time through, and I just love getting time with you.
I'm very happy to do it.
You're awesome, especially knowing you've been teaching all day and then to come on and talk.
Yeah, it's been a long day.
Yeah, your word count is mighty high today. Okay, so one, how can people be praying for you? And then two, how can people track with your thoughts, those kinds of things? I don't know if you have like a website or anything like that. I know you kind of have published a little bit of everywhere, so maybe just Googling your name is the answer to that question.
Well,
but yeah.
Well, I don't publish anything on the internet these days that doesn't go through an editor. I've seen too many people publish silly things that get them into real trouble on their own website. So I don't have a website of my own.
Smart
I
man.
tend to publish through First Things, occasionally publish at a place called Public Discourse, which is the daily news or opinion column of the Witherspoon Institute in Princeton. Sometimes I publish at Reformation 21. Sometimes I publish, if I'm invited to, at the Gospel Coalition. But mainly First Things would be the place where you find me regularly, I suppose.
That's cool. Okay.
And you wanted people praying for me. I like to pray for me as you should pray for other people, and that is we finish well. I do pray that for myself, that I don't do anything stupid.
Yes and amen.
That ruins everything. So pray that when the time comes, I'll finish well.
Amen. Dr. Trueman, thank you so much for being on with us.
Great to be on. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, for sure. Guys, thank you for joining us. That was Time with Dr. Carl Trueman. I would recommend that you would pick up his book. It is available at any vendor. You can go to Amazon, pick it up today. Please check it out. It is amazing. And it does such a good job of, like, just that question of what the heck is the sexual revolution. It does such a good job of engaging that and helping us know how we got there and to look at the culture as it is today. We were talking earlier with Dr. Trueman about how sexual identity has shaped everything. I came across something. It was Ashley Madison. It was a online dating app, and their motto was "Life's short, have an affair." And that's just kind of like standard in a lot of relationships, a lot of marriages, unfortunately. And I think his book just helps us do a lot of work to look underneath that to see who we are and how we can know Jesus together and how we can be one together in a really winsome way. So I'd recommend it to all of you. Thank you for joining with us. This is the Naked Gospel, and we'll catch you guys next time.